Hey everyone, and welcome back to your daily dose of what's hot on Hacker News. Yesterday was absolutely wild. We reviewed 25 stories that hit the front page, and let me tell you, the 5 that rose to the top really capture this fascinating moment we're in with technology. We've got everything from mathematical visualizations that sparked debates about educational design to anime catgirls literally blocking access to the Linux kernel. Yes, you heard that right. Plus some major moves in the developer tool space that have people questioning what our coding future looks like. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's dive into yesterday's top stories from Hacker News. So here's something that really caught my eye on Hacker News today. Show HN, I was curious about spherical helix, ended up making this visualization. You know how sometimes the best projects come from those random shower thoughts, or in this case, morning wonderings? This developer woke up one day thinking about spherical helixes, which, let's be honest, is not exactly what most of us think about over our morning coffee, and ended up creating this really fascinating educational tool that's gotten over 800 points and sparked quite the discussion. What I love about the story is how it perfectly captures that developer mindset of, I wonder how this works, turning into, well, now I've built something. The creator even acknowledges the absurdity right up front, saying, have you ever wondered how to move objects along a spherical helix path? Okay, probably not, right? But that's exactly the point. Sometimes the most interesting tools come from exploring these niche curiosities that nobody asked for but turn out to be surprisingly useful. The visualization itself is pretty clever. It starts super simple, just showing how a cosine function moves an object along a single axis. Then it builds up complexity step by step. You get movement on 2 axes, creating circles, then 3 axes, creating these beautiful 3D patterns, and eventually it gets into what the developer calls chaotic paths, though there's actually an interesting debate in the comments about whether that's the right term. One commenter pointed out that chaos in mathematics is actually an emergent property of deterministic functions, not something separate from them. It's one of those pedantic but actually important distinctions that makes you think differently about what you're seeing. Now, the community reaction has been, let's call it constructively mixed. People appreciate what the developer was trying to do, but there's this fascinating discussion about who exactly this is for. Some folks are saying it makes too big a leap, like you go from here's how we plot points in 3D to boom, here's a complex spherical helix, without enough steps in between. One commenter put it really well, saying it's simultaneously too basic for people who already understand the math and too advanced for complete beginners. It's that classic educational content challenge, right? Finding the sweet spot for your audience. There are also some technical hiccups people are running into. Several users reported their CPU spiking, performance issues, and this dithering effect in the background that some find distracting. One person said they actually had to close it because the visual effects were making it hard to focus on the actual mathematical concepts being demonstrated, which kind of defeats the purpose of an educational visualization. But here's where it gets really interesting. The discussion veered into all these unexpected directions. People started talking about the historical use of spherical helixes in navigation, something called rhumb lines that sailors used before GPS. Others jumped into the mathematical properties, discussing quaternions, Euler angles, and how this relates to game development and animation. Someone even suggested this could be useful for visualizing particle physics or orbital mechanics. One particularly thoughtful critique came from a user who argued the whole approach might be backwards. They said showing functions that create a spherical helix doesn't actually teach you about spherical helixes themselves. It's like showing someone a recipe without explaining what you're cooking or why each ingredient matters. And honestly, that's a fair point. If you wanted to create a different shape, would this visualization help you figure out what functions to use? Probably not. Despite the critiques, though, I think there's something really valuable here about the process itself. This developer had a weird morning thought, pursued it, built something tangible, and shared it with the world. Even if it's not perfect, even if it doesn't quite hit the educational mark it was aiming for, it started conversations about mathematics, navigation history, game development, and the nature of chaos itself.
That's the beauty of ShowHN posts. They're not always polished products, but they're genuine expressions of curiosity and creativity.
And you know what? Maybe that's enough. In a world where so much software is built to solve specific business problems or optimize engagement metrics, there's something refreshing about a project that exists simply because someone wondered what would happen if. The fact that it's sparked debates about everything from mathematical rigor to UI design just proves that even the most niche curiosities can resonate with people in unexpected ways. Speaking of unexpected ways to approach problems, wait until you hear about what's happening with access to the Linux kernel repositories. All right, so our next story is absolutely wild. Why are anime catgirls blocking my access to the Linux kernel? And yes, you heard that right. This one pulled in 778 points and over 850 comments on Hacker News. And honestly, once you dig into what's happening here, you'll understand why people are so fired up about it. So picture this. You're a developer. You need to grab something from the Linux kernel repositories. Maybe you're debugging something critical. Maybe you're contributing to the kernel itself. And instead of getting access, you're greeted by an anime catgirl avatar telling you that your soul is being weighed. I'm not making this up. This is Anubis, and it's this bizarre art project/network defense system that started blocking access to some pretty crucial developer resources like git.kernel.org and the Linux kernel mailing list archives. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Anubis completely flips the CAPTCHA concept on its head. You know how normal CAPTCHAs are those annoying puzzles that are supposed to be easy for humans but hard for computers? Well, Anubis does the exact opposite. It presents you with a computational challenge. Specifically, you need to brute force SHA-256 hashes with leading zeros, which is trivially easy for a computer but literally impossible for a human to solve manually. The philosophical contradiction here is just chef's kiss, right? It's an anti-bot system that can only be solved by bots. You literally need to run automated tools to prove you're human enough to access the site. It's like requiring people to use a forklift to prove they can lift things with their bare hands. What's fascinating is the actual reasoning behind this madness. See, the creator isn't trying to block all bots. That would be impossible anyway. What they're really targeting is parallel crawling and what they call identity scattering. Basically, when AI companies or scrapers want to hoover up massive amounts of data, they typically use thousands of different IP addresses and identities to do it quickly and avoid rate limits. Anubis makes each individual access computationally expensive enough that running thousands of parallel scrapers becomes prohibitively costly. The Hacker News discussion on this is all over the map. You've got people who think it's brilliant, people who think it's completely misguided, and a whole bunch of folks who just cannot get over the anime catgirl aesthetic. And honestly, I get the aesthetic criticism. One commenter pointed out that when you're trying to access critical infrastructure for one of the most important open source projects in the world, being greeted by anime characters feels unprofessional at best and actively off-putting at worst. But here's the thing that really caught my attention in the comments. Several experienced developers chimed in to say that despite all the theoretical limitations people are pointing out, Anubis actually works in practice. Like empirically, it's reducing unwanted crawling. This suggests that maybe the critics are missing something about the real-world economics of web scraping. One particularly insightful comment explained that custom anti-bot solutions like this are inherently more effective than generic ones, not because they're technically superior, but because they require individual engineering effort to bypass. If you're using Cloudflare's anti-bot system, there are probably dozens of libraries already written to bypass it because millions of sites use it. But if you're using some weird anime catgirl proof-of-work system, well, now scrapers need to specifically engineer a solution just for your site. And that changes the cost-benefit analysis significantly. The irony that's not lost on anyone is that this system designed to protect websites from AI is now blocking human developers from accessing the Linux kernel, literally the foundation that huge chunks of our digital infrastructure are built on. It's creating this bizarre situation where legitimate developers trying to contribute to or use Linux are having to figure out how to automate their way past anime catgirls just to do their jobs. And you know what? The more I think about it,
the more this feels like a perfect metaphor for where we are with the internet right now. We're in this arms race between humans and bots where the solutions are getting so convoluted that we're making it harder for actual humans to use the web, all while the well-resourced AI companies this is supposedly targeting can probably bypass it without breaking a sweat. It's security theater, but with computational proof of work and anime aesthetics. The community seems pretty split on whether this is a work of genius or a complete disaster, but one thing's for sure. It's got people talking. And maybe that's part of the point. After all, they did call it a hybrid art project. And speaking of tensions between modern conveniences and developer preferences, that brings us perfectly to our next story about what happens when developers decide they've had enough of cloud-connected, AI-enhanced development tools. All right, so here's something that really caught fire on Hacker News this week. We're talking about Zedless, which is a privacy-focused fork of the Zed editor. And you know what? This one sparked quite the debate with over 300 comments, and it really touches on some fundamental tensions in modern software development. So Zedless is essentially Zed with all the, let's call them modern conveniences, stripped out. No telemetry, no crash reporting, no cloud dependencies whatsoever. The maintainers are calling it no spyware software, that's a pretty bold statement, right? They've basically taken Zed and turned it into what some folks would call a pure local-first editor. What's really fascinating here is the philosophical stance they're taking. They're not just removing features, they're making a statement about software ownership and control. Like, they explicitly reject contributor license agreements, or CLAs, and they actually use the term rug pull in their documentation. Now, if you're not familiar with that term from the crypto world, it basically means when someone pulls the rug out from under you, takes something that was community-owned, and suddenly changes the rules. And we've seen this happen in open source recently, haven't we? Redis, Terraform, Elastic, all these projects that changed their licenses and left contributors feeling betrayed. The technical approach is interesting too. They're not just ripping out network features entirely. Instead, they're saying, bring your own infrastructure. So if you want cloud features, you can have them, but you need to specify your own API endpoints. Nothing phones home by default. Everything's disabled until you explicitly turn it on and point it where you want it to go.
Now, the community reaction has been really mixed, and honestly, some of the criticism seems pretty valid. Several commenters pointed out that Zed literally just added the ability to disable AI features and opt out of telemetry in their settings. So the question becomes, why fork the entire project when you could just toggle a switch? One commenter, Gemalove8, made a pretty compelling case that these changes should really be compile flags or configuration options in the main project, rather than maintaining a whole separate fork. And here's where it gets really interesting. There's this whole undercurrent in the discussion about AI features and editors. Multiple developers are saying they've completely abandoned AI coding assistants after trying them for months. One person described it as digital cocaine. Feels productive in the moment, but actually makes you worse at your job over time. Though, to be fair, others are defending AI tools, just not for direct code generation. They're using them more for learning new libraries or explaining error messages, basically as a smarter documentation search. The timing of this fork is also raising eyebrows. They've only got about 20 new commits on top of Zed's 30,000. That's barely a fork at this point. It's more like a patch. Some folks are calling it premature, saying they should have waited until they had more substantial changes to justify the split. But you know what I think is really happening here? This isn't just about Zed. This is about a growing divide in how developers see modern software. On one side, you've got people who want their tools integrated with cloud services, AI assistants, automatic error reporting, the whole 9 yards. On the other side, you've got developers who see every network request as a potential privacy violation, every AI feature as unnecessary bloat, and every CLA as a future betrayal waiting to happen. And honestly, both sides have a point.
We've been burned by enough free services that suddenly weren't free, enough open source projects that changed their licenses, enough data breaches and privacy violations. But we've also seen the genuine benefits of collaborative features, crash reporting that actually helps fix bugs, and yes, even AI tools when used appropriately. The Zedless fork might be small now, might even seem unnecessary to some, but it represents something bigger, a line in the sand about what developer tools should be: local first, privacy respecting, community owned, or connected, intelligent, and corporate backed. It'll be interesting to see if this fork gains traction or if it ends up being more of a statement than a sustainable project. Either way, it's definitely tapped into something that a lot of developers are feeling right now.
And speaking of Zed, this next story might explain why some developers felt the need to fork it in the first place. Story 4. Sequoia backs Zed. All right, now let's dive into something that's got the developer community pretty fired up. Sequoia just backed Zed with a massive $32 million Series B round. And folks, this one's complicated. So Zed, if you haven't been following along, has been on this mission for the past 4 years to build what they call the world's fastest IDE. And look, speed matters when you're coding. Every millisecond counts when you're in the zone. But here's where it gets really interesting. They're not just stopping at making a fast editor. They're actually trying to completely reinvent version control as we know it. Now, I know what you're thinking. Another VC-backed text editor? Really? And trust me, the Hacker News crowd is having the exact same reaction. We've seen this movie before, right? A promising editor gets VC funding, then either gets abandoned, goes subscription only, or pivots into something completely different. The comment section is absolutely brutal about this, with people pointing out that it's really hard to see how a text editor justifies over $42 million in total funding. But here's the thing, and this is what makes the Zed story fascinating. They're not just building another VS Code clone. They're working on something called DeltaDB, which is this operation-based version control system that tracks every single edit you make, not just your commits. Think about that for a second. Instead of these isolated snapshots we create with Git, where you're basically working alone in your own little world between commits, DeltaDB would track the actual evolution of your code in real time. The founders are basically saying that Git is fundamentally isolating, and honestly, they might have a point. How many times have you had a conversation about code in Slack or Discord or wherever, and by the time someone looks at it, the code's already changed? Or you're discussing a pull request that's 3 days old and half the context is already stale. Their vision is to keep those conversations directly connected to the code itself, following it as it evolves. Now, the elephant in the room here is competition. Cursor, which is this AI-first editor, is reportedly pulling in somewhere between $300 to $400 million in annual revenue. That's a lot of money, and it puts enormous pressure on Zed to figure out their business model. Some commenters are calling it a lose-lose situation. If they go heavy on AI features, they're just another Cursor competitor. If they don't, they might get left behind as AI becomes table stakes for development tools.
But you know what's interesting? The team behind Zed isn't just some random group of developers. These are the folks who built Atom at GitHub and later worked on Electron. They've got serious technical chops. And the fact that Sequoia is backing them, well, Sequoia doesn't usually throw $32 million at companies without seeing something special. One commenter made a really good point. They compared it to JetBrains and IntelliJ. Sure, it's a paid product, but developers and companies are happy to pay for tools that actually make them more productive. And if Zed can deliver on this promise of reimagining how we collaborate on code, especially in this new world where we're working alongside AI agents, that could be huge. The skepticism is real, though. Multiple people in the comments are worried about what happens when the VC money runs out. Will Zed go the way of so many other developer tools? Will they pivot to enterprise features that regular developers don't care about? These are valid concerns, especially given the track record of VC-backed developer tools. But here's my take. The fact that Zed is open source changes the equation a bit. Even if the business side doesn't work out perfectly, the community gets this incredibly fast, well-designed editor. And if DeltaDB actually works, if they can actually solve this problem of code collaboration in a world where both humans and AI are editing code together, that could fundamentally change how we develop software. The timing is fascinating too. We're at this inflection point where AI is changing everything about how we write code, and maybe, just maybe, our 20-year-old version control systems need to evolve too. Git was revolutionary when it came out, but it was designed for a different era. An era before AI assistance, before real-time collaboration was the norm, before we had the computing power to track every single keystroke. So yeah, $32 million for a text editor sounds crazy on the surface, but $32 million to potentially reinvent how millions of developers collaborate on code, that's a different story entirely. We'll have to see if Zed can deliver on these ambitious promises, but one thing's for sure, the developer tool space just got a lot more interesting. And speaking of AI changing everything, let's shift gears from developer tools to consumer hardware, where Google's making some bold claims about AI in their latest phones. All right, now we're diving into something that's got the Hacker News crowd pretty fired up. Google just announced their Pixel 10 phones, and wow, the community has some thoughts about this one. We're talking over 900 comments, and let me tell you, it's not exactly a love fest over there. So Google's coming out swinging with 3 models, the Pixel 10, 10 Pro, and 10 Pro XL, and they're really pushing this whole AI-first narrative. They've got their new Tensor G5 chip, which, okay, we need to talk about this because it's become a real sticking point in the community. Google's pairing this chip with their Gemini Nano model for on-device AI. And while that sounds impressive on paper, people are basically saying, yeah, but can it actually compete with a Snapdragon? The thing that's really catching my eye, though, is this magic queue feature. Picture this. You're on hold with airline customer service, probably already frustrated, and your phone just automatically surfaces your flight details on screen without you asking. It knows you're calling the airline, it knows what flight you're probably calling about, and boom, there's your confirmation number. It's simultaneously the coolest and most potentially creepy thing I've heard in a while. Like, that's genuinely useful, but also, how deep into my phone calls is this AI listening? And then there's the camera situation. Google's claiming 100x zoom with their ProRes zoom feature, which uses AI to supposedly capture detail at these extreme magnifications. But here's where it gets interesting, and by interesting, I mean controversial. The Hacker News crowd is basically asking whether this is even real photography anymore. When you're using AI to essentially imagine what might be there at 100x zoom, are you taking a photo or are you generating one? It's that whole computational photography debate cranked up to 11. The pricing is where things get really spicy in the comments. We're looking at $799 for the base model up to $1199 for the Pro XL, and people are not having it. The general consensus seems to be, why would I pay flagship prices for a phone with a chip that's basically 2 generations behind Qualcomm? And honestly, they've got a point. Multiple users are reporting real-world performance issues with previous Tensor chips. We're talking battery drain, overheating, the works. But here's what's fascinating. Buried in all this criticism, there's this one user, goes by MG, who's like the lone defender in a sea of skeptics. They're making these really specific arguments about why they prefer Pixel over iPhone. Stuff like how the camera bump design means the phone actually sits flat on a table, or how Google Photos handles face grouping better. It's such a refreshing take because it's not about specs or benchmarks. It's about actual daily use cases that most reviews never mention.
What really struck me, though, is this whole other contingent of users who are basically saying, look, we don't care about Google software at all. We just need Pixel hardware because it's the only phone that properly supports Graphene OS. These folks are buying Pixels specifically to not use Google software, which is just chef's kiss levels of irony, right? They're essentially treating these flagship phones as blank canvases for custom ROMs. The sustainability angle with recycled materials is nice and all, and Qi 2 wireless charging is finally catching up to what Apple's been doing with MagSafe, but nobody seems particularly excited about these additions. It feels like Google's trying to check boxes rather than actually innovate.
You know what this really reminds me of? It's like Google's stuck in this weird middle ground where they're not quite matching Apple on polish, not quite matching Samsung on features, and definitely not matching either on performance, but they're charging the same prices. And the community is basically calling them out on it. One commenter summed it up perfectly. They said Google's become the also-ran of the smartphone world, always playing catch-up but never quite getting there. The weird thing is, Google should have every advantage here. They make Android. They have some of the best AI researchers in the world. They've got virtually unlimited resources. But somehow they keep shipping phones that feel like they're perpetually 6 months behind the competition, except in photography where they're genuinely innovative until you hit that 100x zoom and enter the uncanny valley of computational imaging. I think what's really happening here is we're seeing the limits of Google's hardware ambitions bump up against reality. They want to be a hardware company so badly, but their DNA is still fundamentally software and services. And when you're asking people to pay $1,200 for a phone, pretty good just doesn't cut it anymore. And that wraps up yesterday's top stories from Hacker News. What a wild ride, right? From mathematical visualizations that accidentally sparked philosophical debates about education to the absolute absurdity of anime catgirls defending the Linux kernel, to the fundamental tensions in developer tools between privacy and convenience, and finally, Google's ongoing struggle to justify premium prices for mid-tier hardware.
What really struck me about yesterday's stories is how they all, in different ways, highlight this moment we're in where the tech industry is kind of having an identity crisis. We've got developers building things just because they're curious, not because there's a business model. We've got security systems that are more performance art than practical defense. We've got open source projects forking over philosophical differences before they even have technical ones. And we've got one of the world's biggest tech companies still trying to figure out how to make a competitive phone after years of trying. It's messy, it's chaotic, and honestly, it's kind of beautiful. This is what innovation actually looks like, not the polished keynotes and slick demos, but the weird experiments, the heated debates, the forks and failures, and occasional moments of brilliance. Thanks for joining me today to digest these top 5 stories from the 25 that hit Hacker News yesterday. If you enjoyed this deep dive into what the tech community is talking about, make sure to subscribe and join us again tomorrow when we'll have another batch of stories that are getting developers, designers, and tech enthusiasts all riled up. Until then, keep questioning, keep building, and maybe, just maybe, wake up tomorrow wondering about spherical helixes. Who knows where it might lead?